Hi, Dr. Versalati here, and I wanted to talk about Green Chapter 4 and use that to think about the um, English 321 English Linguistics assessments that we did for Assignment 1. So we're going to review these principles by applying it. Before we get started there, I just wanted to make a note about what I expected when I said to summarize the assessments. So for the tense and aspect written assignment, it would be okay to say it's a written assignment where the students choose an authentic text, identify the verbs, identify the verb form using traditional labels, and the use giving the concepts taught in class and in the worksheets, and answer short answer questions, exploring the effect of tense and aspect. I mean, I just wanted for you to describe what the assessment was. And for the Blackboard test, again, these were both homework assignments. They were not tests. Blackboard just forces you to call anything like this a test. You could say it was a computerized test with short, fill in the blank, short answer, matching and multiple choice questions. You could, 43 of them or something like that. You don't have to go into big details when you summarize what the test is. It's just to give some description. When you give test specifications, you also want to say, if there were time limits and things like that. Neither of these had time limits. They were homework assignments. They could work on them, take a break, work on them. Okay, so these were the Green reviews the principles of effective assessment, and he stresses that rather than these being 4 ideas, there's also a relationship between these, with practicality at the bottom or the base, because without practicality the assessment just can't be used. If it takes $1,000 or 1,000 hours to create the assessment or grade the assessment, we just won't be able to use it. And if it's not reliable, we really don't want to use it. That's not to say validity and beneficial consequences are less just because they're at the top and they're smaller. That's not true at all. We want the assessments to be valid and the results to be used in a valid way. And the purpose of all assessment is to have beneficial consequences. So those are the pinnacle. Those are the goals. Okay, so practicality. Just a note about these slides. These are things that you might want to think about if you want to revisit Green Chapter 4. What I'd like to do is focus on applying these ideas in the evaluation. So what are the strengths and threats to the practicality of these 2 assessments? Well, the tense and aspect, the biggest threat there is the time it takes for me to grade. Because each student gets individual feedback, that just takes time, and because each student has a different text they have all different correct answers. So it takes time for me to read the text, make sure that they've identified the verbs and they've gotten all the parts of the verb. Because if you leave out those auxiliaries, it might look like the right label for that form, but if it's not pulled correctly from the text, it's not. So that was the biggest threat. Sometimes it takes me an hour to grade one of them, if the student needs more feedback and explanation of why it's a passive verb or something like that. The biggest threat to the sentence structure on Blackboard is that it takes a while for me to create that and test it and pilot it and make sure that the grading is set up correctly and I'm not missing something or it's not too ambiguous. But that's mitigated in that I can reuse that Blackboard test again and again. So for me, that was worth the while putting that effort in. And it's also good to think about when you're thinking about practicality. Of course, giving no assessment would be less time, but what would be the comparative? If I wrote that Blackboard test on paper and pencil compared to the computerized version, it would still be the time it takes to write the questions and the items underneath, but it would still be much more practical to have the computer grade it. So that was, in my opinion, well worth it. What about the reliability here? How can we build reliability into these assessments? Well, for the tense and aspect one, I certainly could build reliability by forcing everyone to use the same text. Then it would be much more reliable. Students couldn't the biggest threat to the reliability of the tense and aspect is that some students choose easy texts with easy verbs to analyze, and some students pick challenging texts and pick challenging verbs to analyze. Now the question is, do we want to build the reliability by limiting students' choice? This was something that I chose to do and give individual feedback on that. Building the reliability in the Blackboard test, I could, which I did, looked for entered, capitalization doesn't matter. It's already very much multiple choice and matching. There's few fill in, type in answers, but I gave options there. You can look at pages 73 and 74 in green to look at steps to build the reliability in your assessments. That's always a good idea. Now for validity, the key here is that we have to focus on the learning objectives of that assessment. Some people express concern that the Blackboard multiple choice test didn't require the students to answer what they knew. They could, because they could use their notes or something like that. But that wasn't a concern of that assessment. Later on, there was a in-class exam where I assessed their knowledge without use of aids. My goal here was to have them look at the items lots and lots of times so that they could become more familiar. It's called repeated retrieval studying. I wanted them to look at their notes a lot. I realized that lowers the practicality because it's using more of their time, but again, they were undergraduates, and I wanted them to spend time looking at their notes and understanding the concepts. The validity here, when you checked, you could see on the TAM, the tense and aspect assignment, the learning objectives were right at the top, and you could, and some of you pointed out that if you looked at the learning objectives, you could see how they aligned right with the steps of the assignment. Now, the validity of the Blackboard assessment was threatened by not having that listed, and I apologize, it should have been listed in the directions. What some students did is they referred to the syllabus and found the relevant learning objectives that clearly matched, like identifying sentence types and clause types and things like that. Let's move on to the ideas of the idea of validity is how we use it to infer competence. Again, I wasn't using those assessments to see what they could do by themselves, and that's okay. These were homework assignments. Now for the fourth quality of effective assessment, for this class, we're going to put lots of things into beneficial consequences. Wash back the effect that the test has on learning, authenticity, feedback, and the consequences of the assessment. So to me, both of these assessments had high beneficial consequences, but in very different ways. We already talked about that the tense and aspect assignment gave individual feedback. And that's good, right? Individually, I could see exactly what the students needed to know, and I gave it to them. But surprisingly, I feel like the positive washback was actually higher in the Blackboard test, and which was a homework assignment. And the reason why is because they could keep looking up at their notes. And that, though they could also do that with TAM, but when they got the results of the Blackboard, quote, test, unquote, they could see which items they had gotten correct and which items they had gotten incorrect. So it turns out that students find that surprisingly motivating because they want to find out, well, it seems like they want to prove that I'm wrong and that it was graded incorrectly. But what my goal was for them to then look back and see what of the remaining choices was probably the right one. And as a lot of you pointed out, the next day the students worked in small groups, not only to correct the most missed items to figure out the right answer, but also the strategies. Okay, so those are the 4 qualities of assessment, and here this is just what I think. It does not have to be your radar chart. But what I wanted to talk about is when you talk about the balance of these, what I meant was look at this chart as a whole, as a course, as the assessments of a course, and notice that there does seem to be a balance between an assessment that's higher in validity and maybe lower in practicality, which is balanced out by a highly practical and reliable assessment. Do you see how, again, I consider these both high, but do you see how these sort of balance out? And as you add more of these, you wouldn't want a portfolio which is always in this quadrant. Do you see what I mean? Like if it's low validity, but it's highly practical, that might not be the strongest portfolio. And likewise, if you have something that's extremely high on this side, it might not be practical and you might never stop grading. So what we're looking here is considering it as a whole, that some assessments highly fulfill these qualities. It's not likely that any one assignment will fulfill all of them highly. Okay, and some of the other ideas, the summative and formative. The TAM assignment was actually more summatively used. After giving that feedback, I did not use the results of that feedback to change any of my teaching. It just went on. So whereas in the Blackboard test, that was more formative. It did change my teaching for the next time. What we talked about in class, it did affect further learning. The other things that some people mentioned was they noticed that both of these assessments were criterion referenced, and that's true. There's criteria with which those assessments were graded. Those were not norm referenced. Norm reference tests are rarely used in classrooms. And this is a clarification that I wanted to make. Some people called the TAM assessment performance-based. That's not very accurate. I realize that performance-based is probably on a continuum, but on the far end of that, the prototypical performance-based would be open-ended, integrated assignments or assessments that would be like for order a pizza, on the phone. If they did it, if the pizza arrives the way they wanted it, and they could say whatever they wanted to say and figure, whatever language and vocabulary and sentence structure they wanted to use, they could use. That's more open-ended. An essay is also on here. If you say, tell me what you did over summer break, you're not grading the content that's in there. On the TAM, I would say it's more over here, where there were correct and incorrect answers. Okay, feel free to post questions.